This is from the website thewaythetruthandthelife.net. David Butler produced the Michelson Morley video and many others. I'm using his graphics and voice explanation as background for this work.
In 1887, Michelson teamed up with Edward Morley and published the results of their experiment that used an interferometer to measure the differences in the speed of light from platforms moving in motion with respect to each other.
This is an analogy to sound. We hear the change in the pitch of sound of a car as it goes by. As it's approaching, the sound waves push against each other. You have a higher frequency. After it's gone by, they're separated more, and it's a lower frequency. So you hear boom.
Spend a little time here going over how they did it. Since 1801, when Young proved that light traveled as a wave,
a more accurate statement would be that light traveled with wave properties of interference.
And throughout most of the 19th century, it had been assumed that space was filled with a substance called the ether.
This is true, but assuming ether is a cohesive medium is false. The lines indicating a cohesive flow, like a cloud or a river, are false when it refers to ether.
To support light propagation, just like air supports sound wave propagation. The ether represented the universal frame of reference against which all other motion could be measured. The question at the time was, how fast is the ether moving? Or more precisely, how fast is the Earth moving through the ether? Michelson and Morley were trying to answer this question with their experiment.
In true science, we say good answers are easy. Good questions are hard. This is not a good question. The question equates ether like water or a cloud. Ether is an inviscous, inelastic, incohesive. It does not flow, as we'll see later.
A good way to see what's happening is to picture a river that measures d across and is flowing to the right with a speed capital V. Now we put two boats in the river, each moving with a speed lowercase v. One boat will move across the river to a point on the other bank directly opposite the starting point and then return. The other boat will travel downstream the distance d and then return to its starting point. We'll calculate the time required for each round trip.
Time is universal. Don't be confused by the various ways of defining a clock to measure it. We'll try to make these points clear and show where the academic sophistry has warped this and warped that and made very sophisticated equations that you would have to have a PhD practically in mathematics. I have a degree in mathematical physics, but don't be confused. We'll show the common sense insights into these things.
Let's take a look at the boat going across the river. If the boat headed directly to the destination point, the current would take it downstream and it would miss its target. To compensate, the upstream component of its velocity would have to match the flow velocity of the river. This would give us a right triangle, where v' would be the net speed across the river.
This sophisticated-looking formula is a simple high school formula for a right triangle. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. where C is the line opposite the right angle and is called the hypotenuse.
We can calculate v prime by using the Pythagorean theorem. The same analysis works for the trip back, so the time for the round trip can be calculated as twice the time for one way. That's 2 times the distance divided by v prime. Substituting the value for v prime, we get the final equation.
Now, this was just simple high school physics of our three-dimensional real world. The boat is a simple example of an object moving in the flow of a cohesive medium. The analysis of a boat moving in a cohesive medium, the river, is correct, but it has nothing to do with an object moving in an inelastic, incompressible, incohesive, inviscous fluid, where the object itself is made of components that are comprised from this fluid. By that I mean the basic building blocks of particles are vortex rings of this ether fluid. We can get intuitive insight into how ether behaves on the most basic level by observing an incompressible, inviscous, inelastic, one-dimensional model of metal balls. With this simple device, I can demonstrate a one-dimensional fluid of inviscous, inelastic, incohesive matter. It will transmit momentum in both directions at the same time. I'll demonstrate this by having one ball on one side and 2 on the other. It has no problem transmitting in both directions at the same time. This should not be confused with a viscous, elastic, cohesive fluid.
Now let's take a look at the boat traveling down the river and back. The time it takes to go the distance d is simply d divided by the speed of the boat plus the speed of the river. The trip back takes d divided by the speed of the boat minus the speed of the river. Using the common denominator to add these 2 times gives us the time it takes to make this round trip. Let me take a quick aside here, because this is a good equation for illustrating how we use math in physics.
We will uncover Einstein's errors in lack of insight, common sense, lack of mechanical reality experience, but he did understand one basic thing. I'll show you that.
There are weighty arguments to be adduced in favor of the ether hypothesis. To deny the ether is ultimately to assume that empty space has no physical qualities whatsoever. The fundamental facts of mechanics do not harmonize with this view. According to the general theory of relativity, space is endowed with physical qualities. In this sense, therefore, there exists an ether. According to the general theory of relativity, space without ether is thinkable.
Notice that if the speed of the river is greater than the speed of the boat, time goes negative. If we took the equation to be a general statement about time, one would conclude that time can flow backwards.
This is a good opportunity to demonstrate the problem of book learning. There are many book learning geniuses like Einstein that lacked common sense. They didn't have a background of experimental reality. There's a totally different world for a hands-on physical reality and students who were brilliantly raised on book learning without the hands-on experience to give them common sense. For example, time is a universal quantity. It is everywhere all the time, and it only goes in one direction. Here we'll talk about a way you could talk about negative time and not differentiate, like in relativity, how things get so distorted with this abstract false reality thinking. And we can straighten it out step by step. So just hang in there.
But if we stick with the situation that we used to develop the equation, we see that a negative time simply means that the poor, slow boat can never get back to its starting point. The river will simply continue to carry it downstream. Now back to our example. If we take a look at the ratio of the cross-river time, T sub A, to the downriver time, T sub B, we see that it creates an equation that can be solved for the velocity of the river. For example, if the boat speeds are 25 kilometers per hour, and we carefully measure the time of the two round trips to be 10 minutes for the cross-river round trip and 15 minutes for the downriver round trip, then we can find the river flow. In this example, it's 8.68 kilometers per hour. Michelson and Morley understood that the Earth is moving through the ether in different directions at different seasons.
This is the fallacious assumption of Michelson Morley that has been carried on, that they have no comprehension of the reality of ether. They equate it to a flow like a river or a cloud. It is an independent, incohesive material that acts very much different, and it is going in all directions, as I showed you with the balls. And in fact, this ether is a continuum that is constantly hitting and traveling and being deflected. The Earth is a deflector of it. If you think of like light having pressure and coming from all directions in all directions. We'll get to light. Light is fundamentally built out of vortex rings. I'll give you a little physical example of the basic particle construction out of ether by Dr. T.T. Lim. Here it is. Leapfrogging Vortex Rings by Dr. T.T. Lim. I'm Donald Johnson, and when I didn't see Dr. Lim's Leapfrogging Vortex Rings on YouTube, I requested and received permission from him to post them.
In our segment on the solar system, we found that the Earth is revolving around the Sun at 30 kilometers per second. What Michelson and Morley did was to measure the ratios for light traveling with the ether and across the ether to determine the speed of the ether, just like we did for the boats in the river. Here's the apparatus they used. It worked like the one from MIT. only it's mounted on a stone slab and floating in a pool of mercury to allow for slowly rotating the interferometer. Here's the actual interference pattern they saw. As the interferometer is rotated, the light flowing perpendicular to the direction of the ether would take time t sub a, and the light flowing with and against the ether would take time t sub b. Rotating the interferometer would change the ratio from t sub a over t sub b to t sub b over t sub a, and the interference pattern would shift. Using the speed of the Earth through the ether, they estimated that the shift in the pattern would be just under 1/2 of a fringe. But there was no shift. When the experiment was performed at different seasons and at different locations, the results were the same. No shift.
What Michelson and Morley proved was that the ether, even though very active on the microscopic level, on the macroscopic level, the ether clings around all objects. There's a pressure towards objects because on the microscopic level, the ether is being deflected. So it makes like a pressure, the source of gravity. But it's like a cloud being carried along by any solid object. And light is a construction out of these leapfrogging vortex rings. They have their own internal mechanism for swimming in the ether. And the ether is clouded around solid objects as the pressure. Gravity is a pressure, a shadow effect pushing down towards the solid mass. And that equation is shown. I'll give a link to that. Okay.